in the central structures of American society, in traditions that have a deep rootedness in our society. It is not to the new groups, these successor movements that we've been studying, but to biblical religion that we would have to look. A shift away from the uneasy alliance with utilitarian individualism, a profound reappropriation of that biblical conception of life, which has been too often abandoned in the course of American history, might provide something of a mass base through which a successful effort to change American society could be mounted. But at the moment, that shift seems almost completely utopian. There are a few signs of it here and there, but hardly enough to signal a genuine emergence of such a new movement. It may be, however, that if we are to survive as a society in any recognizable continuity with the best of our past, that kind of utopian alternative will have to be taken. Thank you.
Professor Beller's had a long day. He's willing to stretch it out a little bit more. If there are questions from the floor you would like to raise about his comments, lecture.
I wondered how you
Would you stand so that everyone can be
wondered how you would assess the charismatic movement in the traditional churches. Is this in any sense offering possibilities for a reversal of this decline we noticed that's been so continuous since 1959?
I think, like most of the things we've been looking at, that the charismatic movement is ambiguous, that it does represent an effort to live at the immediate personal and interpersonal level more in accordance with these basic values than American society in general for a long time has done. And as such, there is both an intrinsic meaningfulness and a witness value to that movement. The tendency, however, to withdraw completely from larger social responsibility, which is not absolute because there are variations within charismatic movements on that issue, can serve, as all of the movements we've been studying can serve, as simply providing escape valve for the continued dominance of the society. So, to me, the relationship between that kind of spirituality and some kind of social movement, which would be perhaps similar to the abolitionist movement, to the civil rights movement of the late 50s, in bringing the religious insight to bear on practical changes in the social structure. It's that I would say would make the fruition of that renewed religious insight relevant to the problems of the society. Yes?
Further alternative, a Marxist alternative, let's say, like the Chinese system, seems to be somewhat viable for the people who are more enthusiastic about it.
The problem with Marxism is that it has had a very difficult history in America. There's no other advanced industrial country which has had so checkered, so continuously broken a history of Marxism as we have had. I think there are some deep antipathies between the central tradition, either of the two strands of it that I've mentioned, and Marxism. Now, it may be that American society will come to such a pass that something which really has relatively little roots in our own tradition will have to replace it. But it seems to me that it is more likely that some regeneration of things more central in the American past will play that role. As far as China is concerned, it is a society about as different from ours as you could imagine. I believe that the pattern of Chinese communism is deeply consonant with certain features of traditional Chinese thought and action, that it is basically non-exportable to us. The more sophisticated Marxism of contemporary Europe, it seems to me, has more to say to us because it's articulated in a way which is closer to our own philosophical orientations. I know in Berkeley and other divinity schools, the theology of hope, with a certain influx of Marxian thinking, is currently being quite seriously considered. Whether that is going to work in our society or not, I'm not sure, but I would certainly leave that as an open possibility. Yes?
A number of your descriptions on the survey really were about how people think, and I didn't hear many comments on, okay, how do you act it out? Where do you spend your money? Who do you give your money to in terms of charity? What kind of organization do you belong to carry out your social responsibility? And to me, this is what most people would say are your values. You refer to values quite a few times. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I think it's reasonably clear that it's only the first and last categories. After all, the conventionally religious are presumably involved in the life of the church. At least it's hard to go every Sunday and not be a member. The alternatively religious are, by and large, involved in some kind of organized group. The nominal and non-religious are the ones who are not opting for anything we can define as religious as a major avenue for their expression. And of course, that's 53% of our population. So I would say that certainly only a minority of our sample are acting, are in their social action and their social commitments showing that religion is a major motivating factor. Yes?
I was going to ask, going back to the question you were asking, why people place a high value upon material comforts. I think you mentioned the conventionally religious and the alternative religious placed a lower value.
Yes.
And the nominally and the non-religious placed a higher value.
Right.
Is that because the nominally religious and the non-religious are willing to utilitarianism?
Huh.
Or is there some type of paradise on earth or what?
Well, when we have a finding in a survey, we don't know what it means. All we know is what the finding says. Clearly, it seems to me that the finding of one's ultimate meaning in the immediate material world seems to be stronger in the nominally and non-religious. Whether that is to be interpreted in terms of a paradise on earth or anything quite as dramatic as that, I don't know. And I should also say that the differences are not enormous. And as a matter of fact, less than half of any group admits that material comfort is a very important value. It's something like 45 and 49 for the nominally and non-religious, and something down like 15 and 20 for the conventionally and alternatively religious. So apparently still people don't exactly like to admit that material comfort is the main thing they're out after. Yes?
Yeah, I gathered from your paper, maybe I'm reading more into it than is there, that you find nothing wrong or nothing, no difficulty in the fact that there might be something intrinsically dangerous about what you call apocalyptic visions, but rather because I would think that most of the what you call alternative religions have apocalyptic visions which are sort of translatable into political ideologies also. Your argument seems to be rather that the substance of their apocalyptic vision is somehow more congenial to human development than the substance of the apocalyptic vision of the traditional kind of view. Now, I think that this is really implicit in what you were saying, but I mean, couldn't one argue that there's something in the sort of mental attitude of people who act from apocalyptic visions, which makes what you call alternative religious views at least as potentially dangerous as the ones that they're trying to overthrow?
Well, I think all religion is very dangerous.
It's precisely because I think religion is very close to the things that are most important and most powerful in human life. There's nothing that has been perverted with such disastrous consequences as religion. Most of the worst crimes, as well as most of the greatest acts of heroism and love, have been committed in the name of religion. I certainly didn't mean to imply that alternative forms of apocalypticism are preferable to standard traditional forms. I happen to believe that American culture is rooted in a very deep millennial vision that is as close to the heart of this country as anything you will find. And I know that there are people who feel that millennial visions of any sort simply have to be avoided, that they are so dangerous that the best thing to do is to get rid of them. My own reading of American society is that that's not very likely. So the question is, under what circumstances does some kind of millennial vision have a positive consequence, and under what circumstances does it have a negative consequence? I'm fully aware that it can be extremely demonic, as well as motivating positive social change. The fact that we have some sense, however lingering and however undermined in the present situation, that our society might realize the vision which it was established to realize, is to me, I guess, and this may be a very personal judgment, a positive thing. I prefer it to a society like Italy, where cynicism is so total that nobody believes that the society can even survive practically the next minute, which has a very high price of its own.
I wanted to ask you a follow-up question, but I'm not sure whether.
Well, maybe we come back to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
One commentator suggested recently the separation of church and state is a very poor idea because it sets up the idea that state, to use the term used, can be one in its neutral way, and that Protestant religions especially fall prey to this because they don't have a supra-national base, and at least the Catholic Church does have a supra-national base, and that the idea of separation of church and state should be gotten rid of in that sense because of its effects. My question is, in terms of your analysis of biblical religion and utilitarian individualism getting mixed together, would you say that the separation of church and state really comes from the utilitarian individualist tradition, not from the biblical religion tradition?
Well, I don't think I am opposing the separation of church and state. I think I would uphold the separation of church and state. What I would argue, though, is that there has never been in American history the separation of religion and state. From the Declaration of Independence through the first inaugural address of George Washington, through virtually every major public act of this republic, divine judgment, divine guidance, a recognition of a higher religious power has been absolutely central. Now, I don't think that requires, it has not required, and I would hope it would never require, the establishment of one given church. We have moved outward in our sense of the religious dimension of our society from an original vision which saw it as essentially a Protestant society in which we didn't have established churches, because which Protestant church would we establish? But it was basically Protestant, to include the Catholics, to include perhaps most recently the Eastern Orthodox churches, And in my state, we're presently having a flap because the state Senate of California has appointed a Buddhist to be its chaplain. And there are people in Southern California who say, idol worshippers! But I think that is perfectly appropriate. We have a lot of Buddhists in California. We have Chinese and Japanese who are Buddhists. And we can include that too, in the sense that the society in which we live has a meaning, is to be judged in terms of religious values and powers that transcend the society. Again, when I speak of a social movement which might turn this society around, I don't see that either in terms of the churches themselves acting as a political entity or in terms of some kind of religious political party like a Christian Democratic Party. I see it in the classical model of the American social movement, which is usually led by profoundly religiously motivated people, but which remains open to entirely non-religious people who are willing to fight against slavery, for civil rights, or whatever it may be. And I don't see why, in principle, that pattern of a profound sense of the religious meaning of the nation, but without a structural confusion with one church or all churches, can't be viable in the future.
Possibly one more question.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering about the definition of religion, how that's involved in the type of questions you ask. For example, it seemed obvious to me that the types of questions you ask presuppose that religion would have both an idea of a transcendent God and belief in afterlife. But immediately and now I'm thinking of the Buddhists, perhaps the traditional Jew, that would not fit into those kinds of beliefs. And how would they fit into your kind of question?
Yeah. Well, perhaps I went too quickly over that, but it's precisely our alternatively religious group, our 8% that are alternatively religious, who do not accept any tradition, they don't use the word God, for instance, and don't necessarily believe in an afterlife, who do think of their religious orientation in quite different terms. So we were specifically trying to break out of a notion of religion which is defined too closely in terms of orthodox traditional forms. And therefore we did pick up, and beyond this 8%, we found a great many fellow travelers who were attracted to kinds of religion. For instance, we found more people who were drawn to Zen Buddhism, to yoga, to transcendental meditation, than were drawn to the neo-Christian groups in our area. So both knowledge of and attraction to some of these groups is widespread, even though genuine commitment and active participation remains relatively small. Okay, thank you.